Imperial Yeast has been up to some interesting things lately, and they recently announced a product we are super excited about. If you're familiar with Imperial Yeast, you're likely aware of their classification system. A is for ale as an A07 flagship, L is for lager as an L17 Harvest, and so on. Well, they recently released the first strain in their I series, which stands for Imperialis and refers to non-GMO hybrids or derivative yeast strains developed by Imperial Yeast that have been honed to exhibit the traits today's brewers most desire. The initial offering, I-22 Capri, is a hybrid of A38 Juice and A43 Loki, two of Imperial's most popular strains for hop-forward IPA. Whether you're into this style or just enjoy juicier fermentation characteristics, you have got to try I-22 Capri. Learn more about the Imperialis project and I-22 Capri at imperialyeast.com. Lager styles, particularly those of the pale sort, are known for being crisp, crushable, and perhaps most of all, clean. These aren't styles that are necessarily driven by fermentation character, and considering the fact they are lagers, they tend to be fermented a bit cooler than typical ales to suppress the formation of esters. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to chat about the impact fermentation temperature has when fermenting pale lager styles, such as German Pils, is contributor Andy Carter.
You know, we say, I think this is the first thing you learn in homebrewing is fermentation temperature control is like the 3 C's or the 3 L's: location, 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 fermentation, temperature control, temperature control, temperature control. I think it is, in my opinion, the most important part other than the other ingredients, hops, water, malt, yeast, is temperature control.
Yeah, it's obviously one of those things that I think a lot of people will look back to and say, my beer really improved when I started controlling my fermentation temperature. Well, at this point, anyone who's been listening to this show or reading our articles for any amount of time is likely well aware of my perspective on fermentation temperature when it comes especially to lagers. This perspective was heavily influenced by a handful of experiments that we've performed, one of which I look forward to chatting about with you today, Andy, especially since it relied on my favorite lager yeast strain, Imperial Yeast L17 Harvest. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you want to help us to continue producing it, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our first guest of 2025 is someone you've likely all come across at some point, host of the awesome craft beer channel on YouTube and author of the new book, The Meaning of Beer, How Our Pursuit of the Perfect Pint Built the World, Johnny Garrett. I had the pleasure of being a guest on an episode of the Craft Beer Channel a few years ago, and Johnny was recently interviewed by Cade on the Brew Lab. Really an awesome guy, as funny and whimsical as he is knowledgeable about brewing and beer. Given his book's claim about beer essentially building the world, I've no doubt this is going to be a really fun session. To be a part of it, be sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more by Friday, January 24th, as Johnny's going to be hanging out with patrons that Saturday, the 25th. All past sessions are stored on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support and become a patron today over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we really would appreciate that as well, as it helps those who haven't heard of us yet to more easily find the show. Plus, we really do appreciate knowing what you think. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who, in addition to having a remarkable YouTube channel chock full of great brewing-related content, sell what we believe to be are some of the best electric brewing systems on the market. If you've been considering making the move from propane to electric, you owe it to yourself to check out Clawhammer Supply. Whether you're after a 120-volt 5-gallon unit or something bigger like their powerful 240-volt 10-gallon unit, Clawhammer has got you covered. Learn more about everything they have to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to check out their YouTube channel as well. Justin Velder from the Czech Republic wrote in to say, I've been listening to your episodes on Czech Pilsner malt. As a homebrewer who lives in the Czech Republic and also works for Asahi, one of the country's biggest beer producers, I found the topic really enjoyable. So thanks for that. Incidentally, I live not too far from the Czech maltster that produces floor malted Weyermann malts and often order my brewing ingredients from them. It is very cheap at $1.19 per kilogram, which is about 54 cents per pound. And he says it's even cheaper if you buy it in bulk, my word. They also have a pub connected to the malt house and offer tours of their facilities. I haven't had the chance to check it out yet, but I think your podcast has inspired me. Also, one point you may have missed, and maybe this isn't well known, but the Pilsner Urquell Brewery makes all of their own malts. I'm fairly positive it's floor malted, so I think that would push the percentage of floor malted grain quite high in this country, as they not only produce Pilsner Urquell, but their other brands as well, like Cosell. What do you think, Andy?
Yeah, this is interesting. So, one thing that we have struggle with, in the United States of importing things is it's usually a little older than, say, going to a local domestic malt supplier. It would be cool to try a beer made with the freshest possible European malt. I'm guessing there is something, we talk about this, and I'm sure we'll talk about in this episode about yeast strains, but how much does malt control some of the second order processing and second order things you taste when you have a beer like that? I remember the beer just tasting different now when I was in the Czech Republic. Now, maybe that was just the time and place and everything else, but I do believe there's something there. And that's something you can't control, right? You can't just brew the same beer when the distances are involved. I think the first, level up experience someone has, especially when they brew, say, a Belgian style beer in the United States and then go to Belgium, you're like, wow, this beer is so much more hoppier. It's so much more fresh. That's because the beers you're used to that have been imported from Belgium are just older. So it's a very good experience to say, well, man, my Belgian beer doesn't taste the same as these store-bought beers. Well, that's freshness.
Yeah, I had some friends who went to Belgium a few years ago, and, when they came back, their comment was, the Belgian beers that most homebrewers are making in the United States are like caricatures of the Belgian beers you find over there. They're the bubblegum character. And, it's interesting. When I went to the Czech Republic, I kind of wondered, and I went, a year and a half ago. I kind of wondered if when I was drinking Pilsner Urquell, if I was going to have that same experience. And thankfully, I didn't. It was absolutely excellent there. I find it to be quite excellent here as long as it's not too old. It tasted about the same, just better over there because it was so fresh. But first off, my thing with what Justin said here is that I didn't know that Pilsner Urquell owned Cosell. I had no idea about that.
That's funny, yeah.
Yeah, and I love Cosell, so I think that's pretty rad. I also had no clue that Pilsner Urquell malted their own grains, though I suppose it makes sense considering their history. They kind of had to do that hundreds of years ago. So
I watched a video, I think it was on YouTube, like it was a company, it was like I don't think it was Pilsner Urquell, but it was one of those breweries, these no one speaks English places, right? And it was so funny to watch them do everything. They don't just brew.
Yeah.
It's a total operation, from getting the grain, malting it, all the way through recycling their own bottles. Like if you go to Germany, you'll see this, people have the cases. The cases are not made out of paper. They're made out of hard plastic. People recycle their bottles, and those breweries will go through a bottle 5 times, right? So it's really a total operation, vertically integrated operation. And we don't have anything like that here.
Well, and if we do, they're not big enough for us to know about, in part because I think that, Pilsner Urquell is huge, so the way that they're doing that, I just think is rad. But the other crazy thing, speaking of grain, is just how cheap it is over there. My word, 54 cents per pound. That is about as, I think that's about as low as I've ever paid for bulk over here.
Yeah.
If he's saying it's cheaper than that if you buy it bulk over there, I can only imagine, how accessible grain prices are. But right now, grain prices have gone up so much in the last 10 years from where they were when I first started buying in bulk that it's, you're like, God, it's like $70 now for a 55-pound sack of grain, depending on what you want to go with. So yeah, good on you, Justin. Thank you so much for the email. We always appreciate hearing from our fans, especially when they're international. That's so rad to know that you're over in the Czech Republic listening to us blowhards. So we appreciate it. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Alrighty, when we're back from this break, our focus will be on fermentation temperature when brewing German Pilsner using Imperial Yeast L17 Harvest.
Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exchillerator.com today.
Attention taxpayers, the IRS is intensifying collections in 2025. If you owe $10,000 or more or have unfiled tax returns, it's time to take action. Tax Network USA's experienced lawyers have saved clients over $1 billion. They're ready to negotiate with the IRS on your behalf. Don't risk wage garnishment, property seizure, or losing your home. Call 1-800-958-1000 today. Get the help you need at 1-800-958-1000 or visit tnusa.com.
As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
I'm no tech genius, but I know if I want my business to crush it, I need a website now. Thankfully, Bluehost makes it easy. I customized, optimized, and monetized everything exactly how I wanted with AI. Within minutes, my site was up. I couldn't believe it. Plus, Bluehost keeps me protected 24/7. No more worrying about hackers. I just relax and focus on my customers. So, whatever your hustle may be, secure your online presence in 2025 with Bluehost. Head to Bluehost.com to start now.
I've told the story before that when I first started brewing, my original hope was to make crisp, clean lagers, the likes of which, would match something like Coors Light, Miller Lite, the stuff that I was drinking when I was in college. But that all changed rather quickly when I learned about the efforts that apparently needed to be made when it comes to fermentation of these styles. I was living in an apartment at the time that maintained a temperature of about 65 degrees Fahrenheit or 18°C, especially the closet, that was left alone and away from the kitchen. So that wasn't too bad, but still way too warm for lagers. It was great for ales, at least according to the people I was talking to at the homebrew shop. Now, it was only when I'd moved many years later that I got the ability to control fermentation temperatures and finally started brewing these favorite styles of mine. Now, I was thinking it'd be good to start off by first focusing on fermentation temperature in general, just to kind of set a baseline.
Yeah. So as we said at the top of the show, in my opinion, and I think it's a shared opinion, it's the most important thing in brewing after the ingredients. And so to dig into this a little more, we're going to separate temperature from temperature control. So you're going to pick a temperature, but also actively controlling that temperature. I think that's a very important thing. So Marshall mentioned having a steady place, a steady temperature. Think of anywhere in Europe or some type of cave or, fermentation where it's cold, it's actively suppressing the temperature of the fermentation. So it's, as we said, generally viewed as being the most important thing or one of the most important things. And you can pick a cool temperature or a warmer temperature. And in this case, this lagers, they like a cooler temperature. What this does, the first most important thing, or the first thing it does, is it suppresses ester development from the yeast. So esters are chemical compounds that lead to fruity notes in beer. They're a yeast byproduct, and it can change based on the strain, the wort composition, the fermentation conditions, and specifically the temperature.
Yeah, and I will say, it's kind of tough for me to point out what I think is the most important aspect of making good beer these days, in part because I've been kind of biased or I guess jaded by a lot of the experimentation we've done and then the anecdotal stuff that we've heard back from people who like to do this kind of stuff as well. I will say this, though, that when I moved to all grain and in that first year or so before I really started the experimentation stuff, that was probably 3 or 4 years, but I was convinced that fermentation temperature and yeast pitch rate were the two most important aspects of brewing good beer bar none. Like that was it. I'm now convinced that good sanitation, which I was taught like on day one of brewing my first extract batch, I still think that's number one. I think you have to have good sanitation. I think you have to have good water. I think fermentation temperature within a range. I don't think you have to worry too much. As long as you're within specific ranges. And we're used to these yeast labs giving us the range they think that those yeast work best in. But for the purposes of this episode, that's typically going to be between about 48 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 9 degrees to 14 degrees Celsius or so. Because lager yeast are known for being, preferring cooler temperatures to do their work. So we're going to get more into that in a minute. Now, warmer temperatures, what we are taught, I guess, and what we can kind of show a little bit is that warmer temps are associated with numerous flavor characteristics, namely fruity esters. You're going to hear the term esters come up a lot in this episode, but they can also produce fusel alcohols, which are those hot headache-inducing alcohols that don't really feel good in your mouth when you're taking a sip. Is there anything else that you can think of that warmer temps, like too warm of a fermentation temperature, is associated with?
I think what I would say is it's going to be associated with more flavor, given that you're essentially running this little machine called a cell faster.
Yeah.
More temperature allows this thing to start doing things maybe it wasn't programmed to do, so to speak. And it's going to not clean things up. If you look at this and it's a little scary, but you can go to the yeast, one of the best microbes we understand is yeast, and the cell reaction and the types of cycles it goes through.
Yeah. Basically,
you're just letting it not do its job. It's been programmed to do. And I would say on the other end of this discussion, not lagers, but Kveik strains, you found, and it was kind of against common wisdom until it was researched, that you have a machine that's been designed to operate at very warm temperatures, and it still does its job correctly as what we would call beer. So essentially, you're getting more of what you don't want given its evolution.
Yeah. And the interesting thing to me about modern yeast is that it's easy to think of like, the Weihenstephan lager strain, the most popular lager strain in the world. It is the same today as it was 10 years ago, as it was 50 years ago. But we know that's not true. There is such a thing as genetic drift and the way. And in fact, you got all of these labs. Let's take a strain like Chico, probably the most popular ale strain to this day. That Chico strain that was sourced originally from Sierra Nevada. Every yeast lab offers their version of Chico. But the way they got that was they isolated, at least my understanding is they isolated a single cell, propped it up from there, and that's what they're selling as their Chico. We have done experiments comparing different labs' versions of Chico that come back significant. They taste different when everything else is held constant. So, this idea that, if you're using this yeast, all you have to do is this, and you'll get this very predictable outcome. I'm not sure I'm with that. I think it's an interesting thing to look at, though. Now, the thing, again, more general, taking that kind of 100-foot perspective here, different yeast strains are going to require different temperatures. And by that, I mean, you've got the two main types of yeast that we're using in beer, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is typical top fermenting ale yeast, which prefers more or less room temperature. You're looking at about 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees C, compared to Saccharomyces pastorianus, which I also believe is referred to as Carlsbergensis due to the Carlsberg brewery over in Europe, which is your typical bottom fermenting lager yeast. And the commonly accepted wisdom there is that 50 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take a few degrees, or 10 degrees C, is where that is going to ferment optimally. And again, I've wondered, and I really don't know, but I've wondered if this stems from the idea that, did the chicken come before the egg or the egg come before the chicken when it comes to these temperatures? Because we'll get into a little bit of history on lager brewing, very, very brief history on lager brewing in a second, but it would make sense to me if, we had these beers stored in these cold places, not by choice, but because that's all that was available to us at the time. And somehow the beers came out so good, it'd be easy to jump to the conclusion that you have to do that now, right?
Yes. I think the important part of this evolution, if we think like this, it's very hard, time travel's very hard to do. We can't go back there, right? We can't be there at the beginning of all this. But let's just take it for a second to say, taste has evolved over time.
Yeah.
They probably wanted something they could drink. they were not critiquing it like a BJCP judge. So what you probably had was the same yeast cell that evolved, selective evolution, cold or hot, and then it became these things over time. So what we know as Saccharomyces cerevisiae and Saccharomyces pastorianus was probably the same cell, and over time was pushed in different directions.
Well, yeah, pushed in different directions, either by nature or by human intervention. I mean, that's the part that fascinates me, right? Is that there's an element of human intervention that has guided these yeast into doing what it is we want them to do, whether we want to admit that or not. And there is that evidence out there. I feel like it was talked about quite a bit 5-6 years ago that Sac pastorianus is actually the kind of the offspring, a hybrid of Sac cerevisiae and Saccharomyces eubayanus, I believe is what they called it. So they do share that common, for lack of a better term, ancestor or ancestry. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. What we know, though, is that temperature, and we've been able to show this a few times with our experimentation, is that temperature is going to impact various aspects of fermentation and the resultant perceptible qualities of a beer. So we do want to keep that in mind. We're not arguing that you can ferment something at freezing temperatures or at 100 degrees without using Kveik yeast, of course, and it's going to be exactly the same. But what we're curious about is within these relatively small ranges, right? What impact does a 2 degree, a 10 degree Fahrenheit, a difference in temperature, what impact does that really have? And I think, that's why we do this experimentation. Now, when it comes to ales, when you're fermenting an ale outside of the recommended range, when we say recommended range, we're just talking about the commonly accepted or usually recommended by the lab. If you're fermenting it outside of that, if you're going too cool with an ale yeast, say something like Chico, it can lead to sluggish fermentation, poor attenuation, and the production of certain flavor compounds that may not necessarily be desirable. For example, I know a lot of people who claim that if you ferment Chico too cool, so something like A07 Flagship or US05, that it can produce this kind of peachy ester that doesn't really fit with what they might want to be brewing. If you're making a blonde ale that you want to be as clean as possible, and it has this odd stone fruit flavor, that might not, you might not want there. You want that there. If you go too warm, of course, you're at risk of producing those fusel alcohols and just an overly estery kind of unpleasant, finished beer.
Yeah. I also hear, we'll get into recipe, really talk about temperature, but, it's almost like everything, it's like every variable has its own control. So, beer is like a 6-dimensional problem, and we're only on one axis right now. So even if you do everything else, temperature can control other things, and maybe you get stuck somewhere because your recipe, I think the biggest thing is, a very high gravity beer. The temperature is going to be very different than if it was a very low gravity beer and how it responds and reacts. I think my other observation, especially with the Chico strain and ales, is just who makes it and how it's been delivered to you. And the yeast company, like Marshall said, how they've raised their strain is going to be different too. So, I think in my mind, every strain is itself, and what you want out of it, you're going to need to play with it. My recommendation is always pick one strain and learn it versus try 5 of what you quote unquote call the same strain.
Dude, the number of times I agree with you. The number of times that I would go and make like 4 or 5 beers with a certain yeast strain, and then my homebrew shop is out of that brand's, but they've got this other lab's version of that, and I come back and that beer just didn't quite sit right with me. I was like, something's wrong, something's different with this one. Not that it's bad. It's just different. And I think that's fascinating. And oftentimes I think fermentation temperature is the first thing a lot of people will point at as being, well, did you change that? What did you do differently here? And especially with lagers, right? Because if you ferment a lager too cool, first off, you're already so close to freezing that you run the risk of just freezing your beer if you go too cool. But I swear, when I first started considering, jumping into lager brewing, I was told that if you go anywhere above 55 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 12 C, that you're going to create this ester bomb. It's going to be so fruity that it's going to knock it. It might not be bad, but it's not going to be a lager. It's not going to have the characteristics that the BJCP and drinkers like us expect in a good lager. And that's not a good thing. And I think it scares a lot of people off, right? It keeps people from wanting to jump into the lager game.
Yeah. I mean, just, I think that was the very first thing. It's like, oh, well, if you don't have temperature control, you better not do a lager.
Yep.
And kind of funny, I think my second lager that I ever did won like a gold medal at a homebrew competition, right? So it's like, once you learn how to do stuff, it's okay, right? You have to play the game, the hand you're dealt. But I did very early on in my career invest in temperature control because that was what people said to do, and I think it makes total sense to do that.
Yeah, I don't disagree. The funny thing is I was just moving. Everybody knows that I recently moved to a new house a couple miles away from my old one. And in that process, I was cleaning out my desk and came across just a stack of BJCP score sheets from competitions that I'd previously entered. And I feel like I've mentioned it a few times that, I would have almost all of the competitions I entered were with beers that I was doing experiments on. And it was usually the one that was like the experimental beer. I got a 44. I scored a 44 in the first round of NHC 2016, I believe, for a Vienna lager that was fermented at 68 degrees Fahrenheit with lager yeast. Comments were very clean, good fermentation, excellent job. There was no comments about esters. So, it's that kind of, those are the anecdotal experiences that where I'm like, something's a little amiss here. I feel like maybe in the beginning of my brewing career, I was led a little bit astray, but that's neither here nor there at this point. We'll get back to that. Now, a little bit of history on lagers in general. How did it come to be that we ferment these beers as cold as we do? There are historical records that indicate lagers were actually being brewed in Bavaria, Germany, as far back as the 14th century. That blows my mind. And we're talking the 1300s here. It's insane. And you have to remember that this is during a time when as far as we know, right? Maybe they had some records or something that we just haven't found yet or got burnt up or something, but they didn't have a great understanding of microbiology and the way yeast works. They didn't have especially when it comes to temperatures and stuff like that. These beers were just typically brewed in the winter and then stored in caves. And over time, as we do, they discovered, oh, hey, when we do this, these beers come out really good. Let's just keep doing this, right? In fact, the term lager comes from the German word lagern, which means literally to store, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, both lager as a noun, a beer, and a verb, to be lagered, is quite interesting. And then, a nice little thought experiment in your head when you're thinking about how language changes and evolves, much like yeast. And so it's interesting because, again, this is where these guys back then, there was no microscopes. This was all based on rules of thumb from their ancestors. Do it this way. We've always done it this way. And we're good, right? Humans are great pattern recognition units. We see something we like, we do it that way. We see something we don't like, we stop doing it. And we just ended up finding out, by sheer force of will that this is a yeast and this is the way to do it. And then, we now reap the rewards of multiple centuries of evolution to dial in exactly how we should be handling this stuff. So I think that's incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, so do I. And you think about the way social memes start. Now, when we hear the word meme nowadays, we think of funny pictures, but I'm talking about like how something originates, the spark is lit, and then it kind of spreads through society. I highly doubt that in the beginning, in the 1322, when somebody was making one of these beers, they were telling everybody, hey, you got to do it this way. No, they were just like, I just did this and it came out like this. It's my approach, whatever. And then over time, you got these people who are now relying on confirmation bias, and they're saying, well, this is how Joey did it, so I'm going to do it this way, and it turns out this good. So it must be that you have to do it that way. We make this attributional error, right? In our thinking.
Yes.
And that's the thing. We're all, we're all susceptible to these cognitive biases, but a common theory about why, we've adopted this idea that lagers need to be fermented as cool as they do is that the conditions in which these beers were originally being brewed were just more hospitable to specific types of yeast, or even these yeast hybrids potentially, which we now know to be Saccharomyces pastorianus, which just happens to ferment very cleanly, whether or not temperature is at play anyways. I mean, there is actual lab data out there that shows the Weihenstephan strain is just insanely robust and doesn't seem to produce these crazy esters that a lot of people, again, we haven't even got to the yeast we're going to be focusing on for the experiment in this show, but that there is good evidence to suggest it's not as ester producing as a lot of people seem to think.
Yeah, I think that's where, you hear things, you read, okay, this strain does this strain does that, but then you have exceptions, and I think that just goes back to people's experience, and it's kind of like fortunate, like there could be like in skiing, there's the bunny hill, there's the blue diamond, there's the black diamond, there's a double black diamond, right? Some yeast are just bunny hills, right? They'll work. They're not going to be troublesome for you. They might not be very interesting, but they're not going to be so troublesome. More like if a double black diamond, like Britannomyces, for instance, you don't know what you're going to get. It's all moguls, bad terrain, ice. It's just, you don't know what you're going to get. So it's just interesting that you can actually kind of see how people handle stuff becomes how it becomes, and it's just because of genetics.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. So, well, let's focus a little bit on Imperial Yeast L17 Harvest and talk, because that is the yeast. I feel like when we're doing fermentation temperature experiments, you have to look at two different things: the style of beer, but also the yeast that you're using, because it may very well be that certain yeasts are more sensitive to temperature than others. And so that's why I want to just spend a minute focusing on the specific yeast we used for this one. So Harvest is purported to be sourced. In fact, this is what I was told by Imperial, from the Augustiner Brewery in Munich, Germany. This brewery dates all the way back to 1328. This is an old brewery. We were talking about how Pilsners and such were being brewed in the 14th century. This is one of the breweries that was doing it. And if you've never had Augustiner Helles or Augustiner Pilsner, you don't know what you're missing. I absolutely love that beer. I love this yeast. It's my hands down favorite yeast. It's known for producing beers with this notably pleasant malt characteristic that doesn't, blot out the hops. It's super clean and yet has this, I don't even know how to describe it, but it has this really nice beery flavor that I just love.
Yeah, I've used it multiple times over the course of all my brewlosophy experiments. I love it. It's a fantastic yeast. I think it also was the first yeast through all these kind of experiments we're going to talk about today that confirmed for me, like, you can play with the temperature, right? This is one where you can learn a lot about a strain, and you're making multiple styles, right? So you're not locked into like, well, I have this strain for this style of beer, kind of like a Belgian style beer, right? I need this strain to make this style. No, it can handle multiple different styles, which is awesome.
Yeah, and just to read what Imperial says about the way they describe this, and I love it because it feels so conversational. They say this great lager strain combines good flocculation characteristics with low sulfur and low diacetyl. Yes, sir. Clean fermentations produce amazing Bock, Helles, Pilsner, Dunkels, and just about any other lager style you can throw its way. It's a fantastic choice for a house lager strain. I couldn't agree more with that description. They do recommend that you ferment it between 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 10 to 16 C. And that makes sense because the traditionally accepted idea is that if it's an S. Pistorianus strain, which this is, then you got to ferment it cool.
Yeah. And this is how I would market it. I wouldn't change it because that is also what people are taught, right? If you come from a traditional brewing background and not a more modern, I would say, the 2000s and on, right? If you were taught brewing in the 60s, 70s, 80s without all the information we have today, you only think about ale and lager. That's it. If you don't market it that way, people are going to get confused because that's how they learn. But I think we've been a small part of this as Brewlosophy, showing people what other opportunities and options are out there. So I think it makes sense to say it this way, but this is what people are expecting.
Yeah, without a doubt. And the reason I love L17 so much, I kind of mentioned it earlier, is that it imparts beer with this really beer-like aroma and flavor. That kind of reminds me of my childhood when my mom and stepdad would drink like Michelob and Miller Genuine Draft. There was just this aroma to those beers, or this, like when I would take a sip off of an ice cold MGD, that's what I get from it. And I love it so much. I know that a lot of people don't like that. I love it.
So when I first was, this was years ago, I gave a talk at my homebrew club, the Ventura Independent Beer Enthusiasts, about yeast. And my perception of this, and this is something I think I'd like to talk to you about, my perception of lager yeast was that it was allowing beer to be beer, as in ale yeast always had esters, and esters were going to be the main component of what you were tasting, and the malt and the hops, disregard IPAs for a second, but malt and hops become secondary to esters. And I always thought of lager yeast as being a negative, as in it's removing yeast flavor. But I think you're clued into something interesting, which is it is producing flavors that enhance malt character, aka the beer taste.
Dude, you and I are on the same page. And while chatting about this just now, it's like you stole the thought out of my head. I was always trained that in lager beers, you're basically doing everything you can to mute fermentation character, right? So yeast contributed flavors and aromas. Whereas you hear a lot of people like me nowadays talking about their favorite lager yeast strain. Well, if it's a lager yeast, don't you want it to get in there and get out of the way? Well, what I've realized, whether it's esters or not, what I've realized is that different lager strains really do seem to produce different organoleptic experiences, right? You get this different flavor, this different aroma, and that may very well be what defines your house Pilsner or Helles or whatever it is. So I think it's worth testing them out for yourself. Now, here's the neat thing, and I hope it's not because of bias and my own weird influence, but I've heard from so many people who are stuck on, 3470, which is the Weihenstephan strain, or even, L13 Global, or the different versions of that very, very popular strain, who finally give in because of my blabbering on about how much I love L17. And I get emails and they're like, holy cow, this beer is so much better now that I use this yeast. I think there are certain people who just appreciate whatever that odd quality is. I believe it's our own Jordan Folks, though, who isn't a fan of it. And so he sticks with the Weihenstephan strain. I could be wrong. He'll correct me on that. But there are people out there who I've heard from who really don't like that characteristic that I seem to love. So again, preferences are subjective, and there are going to be people who don't like things that I like and vice versa. So some things you want to consider when it comes to using lager yeast or making lager beers is that many different lager strains do exist, all of which claim to produce clean fermentation profiles like we were talking about, yet may very well contribute something different. That's the point that I want to leave everybody with here. So now we talked about the yeast. Let's talk a little bit about the style that was focused on in this experiment, German Pils.
So the BJCP definition of German Pilsner is a pale, dry, bitter German lager featuring a prominent hop aroma. Crisp, clean, and refreshing, shows a brilliant gold color with excellent head retention. I couldn't describe beer better than this description of beer.
I honestly, if all beers were described that way, that would be all I drank and I'd be perfectly happy with it myself.
Exactly. It's amazing. So commonly fermented between 46 and 50 Fahrenheit or 8 and 10 C for over 2 or more weeks before being lagered or stored cold for another 4 weeks.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the pretty typical perspective of your classic lager brewing. In fact, the very first lager beer I ever made was a Czech Pils, and I didn't do a step mash or anything or a decoction, but after the mash and the boil, I did everything kind of by the book. I chilled it down to 46 degrees. I pitched my huge starter of yeast. I let it ramp up to 48 degrees. I let it sit there for 3 to 4 weeks until it was done fermenting. I did a slight diacetyl rest up to like 54 degrees, something like that, because I was too scared of esters. And then I chilled it all the way down. I batch lagered it for 2 weeks, racked it to a keg, lagered it again for another 4 weeks before I even touched the first pint. It was delicious. Don't get me wrong. But that's the pretty classic approach. Is going to take anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks for a standard strength lager. So, what are your thoughts just on that process altogether?
I mean, makes sense. I think there's, tradition and then practicalities. I think a lot of people, you go to certain breweries, I think of Enegren, that's up in Moore Park near me in Southern California. They're traditional German lager brewery, right? They take it very seriously. The amount of time the beer sits in the tank is it's almost religious in the way they take it. Versus maybe a home brew, hey, I can't lager for this long. One keg just kicked. Let's put the beer on. Again, everything is taste is subjective, and do what works for you and what you need. I do think Enegren is onto something there because their beers just taste better. To compared head to head with other people that say they make lagers, and then you have Enegren that says no, they make lagers. They know what they're talking about, right? They're doing something that other people aren't, and I do think that is the time that they take to lager. So if you can swing it, I do recommend letting the beer sit as long as possible before tapping it. I do think there is something to that.
Well, I absolutely see value in home brewers, engaging in traditional processes just as a matter of understanding, what it can produce. You look at breweries, my experience is similar as yours, Andy, like Freem family,
Yes.
or Chuckanut or Wayfinder, who are these world-class lager breweries right here, in the United States. They're making phenomenal beers, and they are, by my understanding, they're using more or less completely traditional methods. So
Yes.
it's not like it, we're not saying that, oh, just because I've had this, my own personal experiences this way, nobody should do it the traditional way. No, not at all. But we've had some pretty interesting experiences. Now, at this point, I've brewed quite a bit of pale lager, with a good number of them being fermented at ale temperatures, way warmer than recommended by the labs. Well, up until about 7 or 8 years ago, my yeast of choice was that Weihenstephan strain, as we found it to be very robust when fermented warm. That all changed when I discovered Imperial Yeast L17 Harvest, which we, of course, tested out in experiment. We're going to be getting to those results right after this break.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app. Are you opening a brewery, or have you already? Did you know More Beer has a pro division? MoreBeerPro.com is your brewery or brewery in planning one-stop shop for all your brewing needs. From complete brew houses and accessories to fermentation and even cooperage, they've got you covered. More Beer also has the largest selection of malt, hops, chemicals, and other brewing products of any vendor at low wholesale prices, all of which can be delivered on the same pallet, saving you and your brewery even more on shipping costs. Visit MoreBeerPro.com today to sign up for an account and talk with one of their knowledgeable brewery consultants.
Attention taxpayers, the IRS is intensifying collections in 2025. If you owe $10,000 or more or have unfiled tax returns, it's time to take action. Tax Network USA's experienced lawyers have saved clients over $1 billion. They're ready to negotiate with the IRS on your behalf. Don't risk wage garnishment, property seizure, or losing your home. Call 1-800-958-1000 today. Get the help you need at 1-800-958-1000 or visit tnusa.com.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of work, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. When I first got my hands on a pack of Imperial Yeast L17 Harvest, I didn't hesitate to ferment a pale lager with it at ale temperatures. I'd done so many beers at that point, fermented warm with various lager strains, namely the Pilsner Urquell strain and the Weihenstephan strain, that I was so pleased with that I figured I'd give it a shot with L17. And lo and behold, that beer came out, in my opinion, tasting great. So it led me to assume that it was similar to L13 Global, that Weihenstephan strain, meaning that it performed essentially the same at warmer temps as it does at cooler temps. Those are the results that we've consistently found with that Weihenstephan strain. Well, never one to settle on assumptions. We did design an experiment to test it out. This one was actually brewed by a friend of Brewlosophy, Jake Freshour, who brought the beers with him to HomebrewCon in Portland, Oregon, where we collected data from attendees. So since this was a post-boil variable, he brewed a single 10-gallon batch of German Pilsner, 95% Mecca grade estate Pelton Pilsner style malt with 5% Mecca grade Metolius Munich style malt, Pretty classic, simple grain bill there. He did a full volume single infusion mash in 148 degrees Fahrenheit or 64 C for 60 minutes. And then once the mash step was done, he collected that sweet wort at the end of the mash step and boiled it for 60 minutes, adding 14 grams of Magnum at the 60-minute mark, 14 grams of middle fruit, and 14 grams of Tettnang at 15 minutes, and then another 14 grams of middle fruit and 14 grams of Tettnang at 5 minutes. Just in terms of that recipe, how you feeling about how this beer is going to turn out, dude?
I mean, banging so far. This is perfect.
Banging.
I would be not doing anything different. I think the great choice of malt, a little bit of an edge by offering a 5% bit of Munich, just some character. You don't want sometimes, especially with beers like this, it is so simple. You're trying to make, where are your edges? What are you letting someone hold on to? And I think that 5% Munich style helps there.
Exactly. And that Munich at that rate, in my opinion, can add a touch of like graham cracker, just maltiness or your kind of generic maltiness. I wonder if Jake didn't make that decision because he wasn't doing a decoction, which a lot of people believe will add kind of a melanoidin, character to beer. So that makes sense to me. This is exactly what I do with my Pilsner. It's 95 Pils malt, 5% Munich malt, or maybe a 10% Vienna. Depends on what I'm feeling on the day. But I love his hop schedule. The middle fruit and Tettnang blend is like magic to me. So here we go. After the boil, he split the wort evenly between two identical fermenters, took hydrometer readings, and found that the wort was at a beautiful 1050 OG. He chilled that wort down. Again, they're split between two identical fermenters, and this is where the variable comes into play.
So filling the fermenters and placed in separate chambers. So one set to 66 Fahrenheit or 19 degrees Celsius, and another set to 50 or 10 degrees Celsius. Once those were stabilized to their temperatures, Jake split a starter of L17 Harvest evenly between them. His observations, at 12 hours, the warm batch was visibly more active. That makes total sense based on the temperature.
Yep.
By 24 hours, both beers had developed a Kreuzen, though the warm batch was a bit thicker, which is interesting. Then again, also, I could see that. The Krausen on the cool ferment batch took 36 hours to fully develop. Also makes sense.
Yeah, so you think about that. Anybody who has done, which there are a ton of people listening to this, I'm sure, who have fermented lagers at traditionally cool temperatures. They take whether you're pitching a nice active starter or not, they take longer to show signs of activity. The Kreuzen on them is going to be slightly smaller or develop slower, I should say. And so all of this so far, the observations are lining up, I guess, with what I would expect given the variable, the difference in temperatures. I mean, this was he's going 50 to 66. So a 16 degree Fahrenheit difference or a 9 degree C difference in fermentation temperature. We know that yeast are going to be more active, just like other organisms, that temperature tends to encourage activity of organisms. So this all makes sense so far.
Yep. So both beers showing no signs of fermentation after 3 weeks. He took hydrometer measurements and they came out identical, finishing gravity of 1.008.
So what do you think about? Yeah, I would have. I don't know. When I first got into all grain brewing, there was a lot of talk about, well, if your FG stalled, if it's not where you wanted it to be, if it's too high, then chances are your fermentation temperature was too cool. So maybe you need to ramp your temperatures. In this case, he didn't change that. He didn't do like a extended diacetyl rest on that cold fermented beer. And yet it still finished at 1008. To me, that's already kind of a small bit of data for us to look and say, well, maybe, you know what I'm saying? Maybe fermentation temperature isn't this, the culprit for these stalled fermentations like a lot of people seem to think they are.
Well, I think in the past, and especially prior to say like 2000, I keep coming to 2000 as like a breaking point in home brewing and everything like that. But let's just say 2000. I think the operating assumption of yeast available prior to that was poor quality yeast, poor pitches. Today, modern pitching, we are giving the yeast the best possible chance of success. I think that's why you're seeing consistent fermentation finishing gravities and not seeing a stall. The other thing we're not doing here is, and it's something common in German brewing, is actually to arrest the fermentation early to then allow some amount of lagering to occur to finish like a point or two. And depending on what brewery you talk to, they actually slow it down by cooling it actively. This was not actively changing the temperature. So I think this makes total sense. You could also see this as kind of a forced fermentation test, which is where you take a small amount of wort and then add a lot of yeast and see how low it can get. That's a professional brewing technique. And essentially the warm batch was a forced fermentation test of the slow batch. So them ending at the same FG makes sense in my opinion.
Now, ostensibly, they didn't end at the same time. I would almost guarantee you that warm fermented batch was done well before 3 weeks. But again, and we do this with Brewlosophy. Jake was taking pointers from me the entire time he was doing this, and we really appreciate him for brewing these beers for us. He only did it because we don't live in Portland, and we didn't want to have to transport beers all the way up there. But he, he's checking in with me, and I'm saying, no, just leave them there until both, are showing zero signs of fermentation, even though that means the warm fermented one may just be sitting still, not doing anything for a week or two. And that was fine. So that was why that decision was made. At this point, with both beers done fermenting, he transferred them into separate kegs that were CO2 purged, all the normal stuff, and then put them in his keezer overnight before he'd fined both with gelatin. Do you have any qualms with the fining with gelatin on this one?
No, I think it makes sense. As long as you're doing the same thing to both of them, let's keep it the same.
Yeah, and we haven't done a gelatin episode in a long time. Maybe we should revisit that topic soon. But fining with gelatin has yet to have any impact on, again, the perceptible characteristics of beer. Even if it's an IPA, we've done hazy IPA, we've done pale ale, dry hopped IPA. It does not seem to have much of an impact. So in this case, the fact that we were trying to hasten that clarity process, the making sure that beer's nice and clear and presentable, I have no issues with him using gelatin in this. So he adds the gelatin and then he lets those beers lager for another 3 weeks. I believe he told me that he keeps his keezer at 36 degrees Fahrenheit. That's like 2 to 3 degrees C. And then they were ready for evaluation. He actually racked them again into serving kegs so that there would be nothing on the bottom that gets shook up during transport to HomebrewCon. And he brought them there for evaluation. Andy, you were at this event. Do you happen to remember doing the experiment for this one?
Did I? I don't. This has been so long. I think I do. I could say I believe I do. Was it this time we rented out a nightclub? I can't remember. Anyways,
don't give away our secrets.
Yes. I want to say I remember this one, and I just don't. I think the beers were just everything as expected. I didn't have any perceptible or memorable, this or that. So
yeah. Well, so when we do, obviously, I don't know if you had joined Brewlosophy by then yet or not,
no,
but it was close to the. You hadn't yet, okay?
Yes, we talked about it at that time.
Yeah, so you would have been still then blind to this one while doing the triangle test, which is going to affect the way you remember it. I wasn't, right? I knew everything about it, so I didn't actually submit my data, of course, when doing the triangle test, but I tried it out 4 different times, served to me by, the dudes from YVH, Jake himself, and I chose correctly twice out of those times. So there's nothing, you can say about that data. To me, I felt like I was randomly guessing. The beers tasted identical to me. That was in my notes. I also took notes from Jake, who tried a triangle test attempt. He just did it once. But he admitted that his initial perception, like before doing the triangle test, he kind of thought the cool fermented beer may have been a little bit crisper, maybe slightly more bitter than the warm fermented batch, but that they were way more similar than he expected. In the triangle test, he got it wrong. So he was like, God, okay, they are way more similar than I thought they would be, which already off the bat, that's not even our blind taster data. You've got the two people who knew everything about these beers that just couldn't get it right in triangle tests. And I think that on its own, again, it's kind of superficial, take it at face value, but it's kind of interesting. Now, of course, that's not what we want people to take from us. We want them to see the blind taster data. And in this case, because we were at a conference, 47 people participated in this experiment, out of which 21 would have needed to identify the unique sample in order for us to say with some level of confidence that there was a real difference between these beers that was, because of our controls, likely caused by the variable. And in this case, how many of those 47 actually got it right?
we got to 25, which is 53%, which is a significant result. We did it, a significant result, the rare significant result on Brewlosophy.
Not only that, the rare significant result on lager fermentation temperature experiments at Brewlosophy, which I think we can extrapolate some really interesting information out of. And I don't want to. One of the comments I feel that people have made when we write our articles on significance experiments that we do is you're trying to minimize the findings. You found it was significant. You should talk about it as being significant, but that's not how we operate. I value equivocalness. It may very well be that there's some other explanation that I'm unaware of for why a result was significant. Same thing with non-significant results. In this case, though, you're looking, if we just shared that data, you'd look and you'd say, well, wow, okay, fermentation temperature matters. It's probably best to ferment cool because these beers tasted different. But I'm here to tell you, as one of the nerdy dudes who tasted these beers a lot and who tried 4 different triangle test attempts, these beers were not that different. What people picked up likely wasn't huge. And in fact, in my conversations with participants after they took the triangle test, most of them were like, yeah, the difference wasn't much, but I felt like this one might have had a little bit more malt flavor and this one had a little bit more hops. Nobody that I recall talking to mentioned anything about esters, which I thought was fascinating.
That's interesting.
And so what happens when we get a significant result is that we ask tasters, we tell them to put one of the beers, because they got 3 beers in front of them in the triangle test. If they're correct, we ask them to put one of the beers aside, and that beer happens to be one of the 2 same beers. So now they've only got the 2 different beers in front of them. People who are wrong, by the way, still have to do this step so they don't get any hints as to what's going on, but we have them compare the similar beers. So that's just trash data. It's just there so that they don't pick up that they got it wrong. So we ask them then to taste these 2 beers and pick the one you think tastes the best. And they have the option to say, I don't detect a difference, or I perceive a difference, but I don't really have a preference. I like them both the same. I don't like them both the same, whatever. In this case, fascinatingly, 14 of the 25 people who tasted this beer, who got it right on the triangle test, preferred the beer that was fermented warm. That is a majority of people who were correct on the triangle test preferred the warm fermented beer, while only 8 people, so just a little over half, preferred the cool fermented version of the beer, and 3 said they have no preference despite perceiving a difference. I am on record as saying that I hate preference questions. It's subjective, yada, yada. What do you make of this data, though? I think it's fascinating.
I think, okay, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a limb here.
Do it.
I think that why the preference is derived is that in actuality, people that say they're doing lager style brewing in professional brewing are actually fermenting warm. And that's why there's a preference.
Huh. That's interesting. So you think that it's because these tasters, we'll just say are accustomed to lagers that are fermented warm secretly.
Yes.
I don't know, dude. Here's the thing. I think most people who drink, who if you're drinking a lager, you're probably buying, if it's not Miller Lite or BMC, it's probably another Pilsner or Kell or something like that.
Sure.
I mean, up until 10 years ago, you were lucky, probably unlucky actually, if you found a craft brewery that was making a lager, because they just weren't doing it for the same reasons homebrewers weren't, and if they were, they really didn't taste that good, in my opinion, up until, again, 10 years ago or so. So I don't know if that could be it. I've wondered that as well. Another possibility is that the people who are taking this test just happen to like ales more than they do lagers. So
also possible. Yeah.
Okay. So the esters are there. But again, there was a cold fermented beer that right next to this one that I tasted, or I couldn't really tell apart from the warm fermented one. So, and I consider myself not the best, but a decent, beer evaluator. They were so incredibly similar. What I wonder is if that warm fermentation didn't further the process. So those beers weren't lagered for 8 weeks. They were lagered for 3 weeks. So what if that warm fermented beer tasted more like what you would expect from a beer that was lagered for 8 weeks, because we know temperature encourages activity?
This is also possible. I mean, that makes sense. So if there's some type of essentially timeline, all beers go under for a given yeast strain, that you just essentially accelerated lagering, so to speak, that you accelerated the cleanup process.
Yeah.
I could also see that. I buy that too. That's a bit more scientific than my hot take. So I like that. Yes.
Well, I'll tell you what. Having had Jake's an insanely good brewer. I believe he's an Oshbody winner. He just a great brewer. Both of these beers were absolutely excellent. I believe the kegs kicked within like an hour of us starting to collect data, because once we got to a certain point, we we're just giving it away.
Sure.
I loved both of these beers. I thought both were excellent. There's something about L17 Harvest fermented warm, that beery thing that I was talking about earlier, it really seems to accentuate it. Not much. It's not crazy. But when I fermented at 66F or 19C, I get that and I love that. And I know that sounds blasphemous and people are going to think I'm just a terrible brewer and beer drinker, and that's fine with me. But my takeaway from this experiment, which aligns with my personal experience, I've since brewed basically a similar experiment side by side. One was like a 1 gallon batch. I didn't collect data on it. And I liked the warm fermented one just as much as I did the cold fermented one. So I see no reason not to hasten the fermentation process by fermenting warm. What about you?
I mean, in the end, preference will be king. If there is any advantage to making your beer faster, because I need this beer for this event and I only have this much time, and you do enjoy the yeast, then go for it.
Yeah.
There's also something to be said for tradition. I think we touched on the ability for a home brewer to bake beer literally however they want. There is no business end to this. There is no serious financial scrutiny. Make the beer you want to make. And so I think in the end, your preference is everything. And if it turns out that you can make the beer faster or more differently or optimize for something else, and you're still making your flavor metric, then go for it.
Amen to that. And by no means are we telling people you should ferment warm, or emphasis being on the word should. We don't care how you make your beer. Don't be afraid of doing it. If you're in a pinch and somebody's request, you promised to make somebody a keg of beer for an event and you forgot to do it and you've only got 2 weeks, ferment it at 66. It'll be done by then. I mean, that's the beauty of being flexible with your approach. If you want to be dogmatic and you want to be married to, traditional opinions or whatnot, by all means do it. We're not judging you, but be cool. I think we can attract more people to this hobby if we stay cool like that. So we do have some reader comments to get to. The first one comes from Corey White, who says, these experiments have made me seriously consider trying a lager, even with my shoddy temperature control.
Go for it. I mean, I think what we've been showing, I think we have enough data now from all the articles that, modern yeast is incredibly robust. It has gone through a pretty rigorous growth and, evolution, even some evolution in the last 20 years, to that the ability to get one pouch of yeast, add that to a beer and have a successful fermentation is almost a guarantee.
Yeah.
And to be able to have that essentially safety is incredibly empowering, especially to a new brewer who's a little bit worried, who's read the old books, who has been told by the old curmudgeon at the homebrew shop, oh, you got to do it this way. It really provides a peace of mind that we didn't have 20 years ago.
God, I regret the fact that I used to be that guy. I mean, there were so many times, you probably have been on some level too, Andy, where it's like, a new brewer shows up and they serve a beer to you. They're already admitting that it's not great. And you're like, well, did you do this? Did you do that? I tasted the arsenal. I got DMS. You got to do this. And like, that is, if anything, what I've gotten from Brewlosophy is just be a little bit more humble. We're not all knowing. We are by no means, this is a great hobby for messing around with, and I'm glad that we get to do that. Another comment. This one comes from somebody who actually participated in the experiment. His name's Adam, and he says, this was a very interesting experiment to taste. I had a very hard time picking one that was different. On aroma alone, I was sure I had the odd one out, but after sipping them over and over, I just kept second guessing myself.
Especially since it's the same, every other variable is the same, you're starting to become completely nose blind and tongue blind to the beer, right? You're like, what is wrong? What's different? I can't taste anything. And then you're like, well, this is it. That's why, in general, we recommend the tasting as like kind of a drive-by. You get your initial reaction before you get lost in all of the nuances and then second guessing and everything. Yeah. So it makes total sense that it was just very hard to tell apart. They are very similar beers.
Yeah, especially when the delta, the delta and that perceptible difference isn't that big. the more you focus on it, the more you're going to confuse yourself.
Absolutely.
It's weird because you don't want to like direct people on how to taste stuff or whatever, especially when you're collecting data. But there are certain tricks that like sensory analysis, professional sensory analysis folks use, and that's one of them. You want to be quick. You want to go with your first thought. And so I hear what you're saying, Adam, and I was there with you. I couldn't get it right. So I think you and I share that. Final comment comes from Ben Morgan. This is a good one. He says, I tend to agree that the effect of fermentation temp may be strain dependent. I think the traditional distinction between lager yeast and ale yeast is too simplistic, and there may well be a few surprises in the results of genetic strain tests if they are made public at some point. Also, I wouldn't read too much into the preference results. Amen, Ben. For instance, in this case, perhaps most tasters prefer ale to lager. So ale-like characteristics in the warm fermented beer are preferred. Just supposition, of course, but the important point is that the p-test matters more than the preference survey.
100%. I give that a p-value of 1,000. I think the main thing is not that there is a preference, that no one came to the fourth option that Marshall did not offer, which is this beer sucks.
Yeah.
No one is saying, I would never drink this, right? They're all saying it's still beer, and they're very similar. So regardless of preference, the similarity and the positive, not the negative evaluation of the beer is what we care about.
Yep. Couldn't agree more. And I'm not sure I could say it any better than you and Ben together. The p-value, as much as people want to crap on the p-value, I understand why. I get it. It's not perfect, but either is beer, and we're not saving lives with this. We're brewing beer. It is a useful tool. And to me, if we're looking at, do specific variables have a noticeable impact on the qualitative aspects of a batch of beer, the p-value is a perfectly fine tool to use to discern that. And while the preference stuff I think is fascinating sometimes, like in this case, usually to me it's trash. So because preference is subjective, and there are people out there who absolutely love Mickey's Ice, and I don't. And that doesn't mean that one of us is right and one of us is wrong. It just means that one of us likes something that the other doesn't. And on that is all the time that we've got for this episode. Do you have any final comments, Andy?
I think it just shows, like I said, the rare, significant experiment. But then again, also, your preference will come down to it. You could be someone that can't tell a difference. So guess what? Now you can ferment this at 20 degrees Fahrenheit differences and not detect a thing. I think it just shows, again, the robustness of modern ingredients that maybe didn't exist 20 years ago, and the things that we took dogmatically a long time ago in home brewing and professional brewing, are a little different now. But that's the evolution of the hobby and the evolution of the craft.
Yeah, of perspectives, really, right? And that's kind of shifting ideas and ways of viewing things. I mean, I had a funny experience that your comment reminded me of, where I made a warm fermented, I think it was a Helles, served it to my friends, told them it was I lied to them, that's what we do. Told them it was traditionally fermented. They all had great comments about it. We were drinking it, and about an hour into it, I said, oh, you know what? This is actually a batch I fermented at 66. And lo and behold, about 3 of the people were like, oh, I thought I was getting esters in it. Yeah, I'm picking this. That's just the kind of, that's how humans are. So it's not like a bad thing. But my point on that is, if you try it out and you serve it to your friends and you don't tell them how you made it, chances are they're not going to know you fermented it warm. So with that, don't forget to subscribe to The Brewlosophy Show over at youtube.com/@TheBrewlosophy Show, where Martin is putting together some killer brewing and beer content that we're confident you're going to love. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of the episode. The Brewlosophy Podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy Podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.